Did you fill out a witness form? Did you fill out a witness form? Yeah, okay. I want to remind everybody to do that first meeting this year. I want to be reminded of that. Proceed, Senator Wallen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Senate Bill 528 I present to you today. This is the same bill that Senator Sifton and myself presented. Senator Sifton had Senate Bill 289 and I had 314. We did a combination of those two bills and it did pass out of this committee 10-0 with the consent of 10-0 as well. And I'd like to also have it go out as a consent bill. The fiscal note is the kind I like. Well, actually, I like them to be positive, but this has a zero fiscal note to that. There was a National Crime Victimization Survey that talks about identity theft. And this, of course, bill would not require Social Security numbers on applications that already have the number included with the first application. You've probably heard about all the identity theft through Target, Neiman Marcus. I think it was Marshalls are having some issues now. Actually, 11.7 million persons, representing 5% of all persons aged 16 and older in the United States, experienced at least one type of identity theft in the last 2 years. And that total cost for identity theft was over $17.3 billion over that 2-year period. So we try to keep personal information out there at a minimum, and identity theft victims do pick up on that. We've experienced unauthorized use or attempted use of personal information such as Social Security numbers, and they use that to open debit and credit cards, telephone, checking, savings and loan, mortgage accounts. So the misuse of personal information for fraudulent purposes is very rampant, and this bill would just make sure that we don't have to put out more information on the person's identity than we need to. And with that, I'll take questions.
Questions, Ms. Senator? Seeing none, we have a witness.
I think someone's going to just put down something saying they're in favor of the bill, like they were earlier. If not,
Andy here. Andy's here.
My name is Andy Briscoe, and I'm the legislative liaison for the Division of Professional Registration, and we want to thank Senator Wallingford for introducing this bill and their support of this measure.
Any questions to the witness? Seeing none, anyone else wish to testify in favor of Senate Bill 528?
Good afternoon, Brad Bates, Missouri Osteopathic Physicians Association. I would like to go on record as in favor of the bill as well.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Chuck Pierce representing the Missouri Society of CPAs, and we just want to go on record and support the bill.
Appreciate your all's brief testimony. Anyone else? Seeing none, anyone like to testify against Senate Bill 528? Seeing none, anyone want to testify in favor of information purposes only? Seeing none, I will close the hearing on Senate Bill 528. Thank you, Senator. I will make an announcement here. Emily Daniels is here with Progress America. She will be, Progress Missouri, my mistake, and she will be recording. I don't know, videotaping too, or just recording, or what are you doing?
Both, sir.
She had permission from the chair, and we did know in advance that she was going to be here. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Next, we'll hearing on Senate Bill 630, Senator Wallingford. Yeah.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Again, Senator Wallingford representing Senate District 27. Senate Bill 630, this act authorizes a candidate's representative or proxy to draw numbers for the purpose of establishing the order of the candidate's name on the ballot. For candidates who file a declaration of candidacy by mail because of physical disability or active duty in the armed forces. Having been a 25-year combat veteran myself, this bill wouldn't actually have affected me because I was on active duty, but we have a lot of National Guard and reservists that are serving our country overseas, and I believe they should also have the opportunity to be first on that ballot if their number they draw also allows that. It gives them a fighting chance in the election. With that, I'll open for any questions.
Questions, Ms. Senator?
So you believe that family policemen is a bit of a role in elections? Huh?
I haven't personally done a study, but I've had enough people tell me that it could make a difference between 2 or 3% of the vote. Whether that's true, I don't know, but I hear it enough.
Thank you.
Mr. Pierce?
Thank you. I think it's a great idea. How would you officially become a candidate's representative? Will they have to run a letter, or would there be an affidavit?
Well, I think
or how would
if
that-
this legislation is approved, then they would probably get the rules to have the forms necessary for that person to designate someone to be there, be an application for them to file.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Any additional questions, Senator? None. Witnesses in favor of Senate Bill 630.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Mark Rhodes. I appear on behalf of the county clerks and election authorities. This is leveling of the playing field bill. We totally support it. Be happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Seeing none. Thank you. Anyone else like to speak in favor of Senate Bill 630?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, John Scott from the Secretary of State's office. This is an issue that we heard about last year from local election authority in Senator Wallingford's district, and we had discussions with the interim committee on elections on the House side this summer. It's a good idea. I know Senator Krause has been interested in the idea as well, and we just want to make sure that candidates that happen to be in the military are deployed, and also folks that are disabled are just on even footing with other candidates. So we appreciate Senator Wallingford filing some legislation, and also Senator Krause, I think, filed some other legislation. So we're in strong support and very appreciative.
Thank you, John. Any questions for John?
Appreciate you mentioning me. I was going to say anything, but I do have a bill similar to this. Interesting note, and I will probably tell this at a later date. I actually came back from Iraq to file for office for the House in 2004. If I hadn't been able to take leave to come home, I would have been able to file for office. This allows a soldier that is employed may not have an opportunity to come home and file for office, and I think that's the right thing to do. So appreciate the Secretary of State stepping up and Senator Wallingford for filing the bill.
There's a small nuance between Senator Wallingford's bill, Senate Bill 630. I think it was filed maybe a week or so after Senator Krause's, and we wanted to expand the legislation to allow folks to also stand in line, to have proxies stand in line, not just take the number. So there's a small difference there, but the idea is one that we strongly support.
Okay, thank you. Question, any more questions, witness? Anyone else like to testify in favor of Senate Bill 630?
Sorry, I just need to add one thing. Because we would like for this to apply to candidate filing this year, which starts on February 25th, it's important that the legislation moves quickly, so we've included an emergency clause. I know this isn't customary of this committee, but if the committee would see fit to perhaps accept on the bill, today, I don't know if Senator Wallingford has already made a request, but moving the legislation quickly and getting it to the governor before filing starts is, without it, the legislation is worthless. So I'd like to reiterate that. Thank you.
With Senator Watson, I respect for him not being aware of this and everything, and we weren't aware he wasn't going to be here. So just information for the committee that we may have a short meeting, maybe tomorrow, we'll see what the fire requirement is, and just exact out on this, and we'll discuss that later on. Next witness.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Sean DeBria. I'm Executive Director of Central Independent Living, representing Missouri Central Independent Living, and also on record in support of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to show support of this bill? Seeing none.
This with my fiscal conservatism, this also has a zero fiscal level.
Appreciate that. Anyone like to testify against Senate Bill 630?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's a small issue. Senate Joint Resolution number 31 is the constitutional amendment that would allow the General Assembly to promulgate a statute that would require photo ID. It's a may, it doesn't require the General Assembly to do that, but it's a constitutional amendment for that. Mr. Chair, did you want me to talk about the Senate bill at the same time, or you want to do them separately?
We were just talking about that, and like you say, witnesses from testifying twice. So let's go ahead and proceed with it.
So that, Senate Joint Resolution 31 is the constitutional change, and Senate Bill 511 is the statutory change that would go along with that. Once again, it's the requirement for photo ID, the non-expired driver's license, non-expired non-driver's license, another identification by Missouri National Guard, United States Armed Forces, United States Department of Veterans Affairs, or any U.S. or state of Missouri ID that has a photo that is not expired. If you showed up to vote and you didn't have one of those forms of ID, that you would still be able to cast a provisional ballot. If you were physically disabled or mentally disabled. If you were born before 1941 or had a religious belief that kept you from having identification, you could provide a provisional ballot. Those ballots would be kept separate. The signatures would then be verified, and if your signature matched, those provisional ballots would be counted. This is some form of voter ID has been passed in 18 different states. Indiana was the first one. Their state Supreme Court upheld it in 2008. Kansas passed their voter ID before the last presidential election, and there was no issues in the state of Kansas. When surveyed, over 70% of the people believe this is the right thing to do. In fact, I was talking to people over the weekend, and they said, we don't require it already. Most people think it's already a requirement. I'd be glad to answer any questions about the legislation and constitutional change.
Question to the Senator. Scott.
Thank you, Required. As I look through the Senate Bill 511, I don't see early voting language. I know that we've had that at different times in the past and various renditions of that. So I just want to clarify that I'm not misreading. It's not in there.
It's not in there right now.
Is that something you have an open mind to? I guess.
I'm open to discussing it with you that wants to move the bill forward.
Appreciate that.
Thank you. Senator, can you go back to Senate Joint Resolution 31 where you said may?
Right, it's the, right there, line 2, it says may be required by the general law to identify himself. It's not a requirement, I mean, by passing the Constitution, there's not a requirement for voter ID.
It would be the statute that...
Right, it just sort of allows the General Assembly to promulgate a statute that would say, hey, you're required to provide a photo.
So,
You don't have to do it.
I mean, you're presenting these together, and I would
Correct.
imagine they would move together, but really, this could pass in our Constitution without the other thing being passed.
Correct. And we wouldn't be able, you wouldn't necessarily be required to have an ID at the next election.
Okay, it threw me off. Thanks for the clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What do we do about people that can't afford that?
That's also in the ones that can provide a provisional, we're giving a free ID to anybody, but if you needed a supporting document that you couldn't afford to get, like a birth certificate, they can also cast a provisional ballot. We're giving one free ID to everyone that wants it.
Well, let's talk about that. So, a guy walks in and doesn't have a photo ID, but he give a provisional ballot.
Correct.
And how does that provisional ballot get counted?
Okay, so a person would fill out the ballot, I would assume put it in an envelope, and this is my understanding of how it would work. I'm not an expert at the law.
It's your bill.
I understand that, but I'm not an expert on how it would be done. But my understanding of what would happen is they would come in, they'd cast their votes, they would put it in an envelope, which they would sign. That signature, just like an absentee ballot, that signature on that outer envelope would then be verified, and if it was verified back to the election authority that was the correct signature, it would be counted.
Right.
But it's kept separate in an envelope, I would assume, to keep it secure.
And that doesn't help with that. But I guess my major concern about that is, I signed that card at the election board when I was 18 years old. I'm not going to tell you how long ago that was, but it was a real long time ago. I know
You've never moved, Senator?
I've never moved.
Never moved.
I live with my family home, yeah. And I signed my election card, Joe. Because because my name's Joseph. So, I'm curious, what do we do to people because people do start voting when they're 18, what do we do when they turn 55 years old?
Senator, I believe that most people have identification. I mean, I don't think this is going to be a huge issue. I think for the most part, people have IDs. They have to have an ID to cash a check. They have to ID to buy alcohol. We can't go anywhere today without an ID. You have to have, most of the time, you use credit cards sometimes. So I believe this is not that big of a problem, but I know that there's people on the other side that do believe it's an issue.
Yeah, and, well, you touched on a couple of things here. Number one, I agree with you, I don't believe it's that big of a problem. I don't know why we have to address it.
I believe the issue is a big problem. I don't believe that there's not a lot of people without IDs.
And I gotta ask you, why do you think the issue is a big problem? And has anybody ever been arrested for impersonation in the state of Missouri?
In the state of Missouri, it's hard to tell because we don't require it now, but I do have I have a book full of fraud in elections, and I do have an individual that actually was caught voting for their son. And the only reason they identified it was his son was born in '94, and the guy that was voting had gray hair. I mean, so the election judge said, this looks a little funny, 94 gray hair, and did some investigating. So it happens, and we had a Cincinnati situation where a person actually voted several times absentee for their spouse, for people living in the household, and even voted twice for themselves.
Absentee.
Voted absentee and then went to the election authority, actually went to the polls and voted again. And she said, I wanted my vote to count. And so she got 2 votes when you and I and everybody else got 1.
But that was in Cincinnati?
I was in Cincinnati.
Okay. So, I gotta ask, are we carrying the torch for the vote or for the country here, or what are we doing?
I believe that we need to make sure that everybody's vote counts. One person, one vote. And we can't, without an ID, we can't make sure that that's not happening. Just like the situation where the son was out of town, and consequently, because he was out of town, the father grabbed proper identification, utility bill, or whatever, saying, I am my son, basically lying, and went and voted. We don't know that that's not happening without a proper identification.
So, I agree with you, we want to make sure that every vote counts, but in doing that, are we making sure that not every vote counts?
No, if you come in and vote, and you get an opportunity to vote. I mean, I don't understand what you're...
I mean, are we excluding a class of people from their
We've done-
ability to go to the poll?
We've done everything we can to allow people to vote, even with the provisional ballots and verifying signatures. So we've gone to the nth degree, and it's been held in other states, like Indiana, which has similar legislation.
So, and even if I can see that we need to have a valid ID, you go into any college campus today, and you can get probably whatever kind of ID that you want to get. I mean, I defend some of these kids. I don't know. I don't understand how that fixes the perceived problem.
I think you identify exactly who the person is, and that's how we're ensuring that the election is going properly.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Sagan,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, I agree with the premise of the personally, but I did notice that anybody born before January 1st, 1941, shall be allowed to have a provisional ballot. Where did you come up with January 1st, 1941?
That was in previous legislation, but it really boils down to people that were born before a certain date. Some of them don't have a proper birth certificate, so it's kind of hard to get the.
So it has to do with the proper birth certificates?
Well, you got to drive, yeah.
Yeah, like that. I was just curious as to where you came up with 1941. I would have thought maybe you would put, the next year is going to be 73 years of age now. Next year it'll be 74. The next year it'll be 75. Seems to be more sensible to have 73 years of age.
I'm willing to work with anybody that wants to change legislation for
But you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
Essentially, we're
I
going
think
to
that
get 100.
I think that primarily it gets down to the fact that some people born before that date weren't born in hospitals and don't have proper birth certificates.
Thank you.
Paul,
Yes,
I want to know more about that case where the guy voted for his 94. I guess I have a daughter of 194 too.
I have a son who's born 92.
Yeah,
But I'm a little younger than a gray-haired
yes,
individual, so.
yes, you're a young man. So.
I'm not that young.
Where was that? Where was that?
It was in New Mexico.
New Mexico. And what type of ID did he try to present in that case of fraud?
I am not catching it right off the top of my glance. Let me give me a second to read.
Because as the discussion we had with Senator Kennedy here, people have to prove their identity of some sort. They have to show them something when you go vote. The question in your bill is a photo, a government photo. So it'd be interesting to know how that case in New Mexico
But this is
changed some elections here in Missouri.
They don't have all the facts in this article, but I'd be glad to share the article.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Afternoon.
I was just curious what the purpose for the change on page 7. Down in section 1:15.430 talks about what elections that this section is going to apply to. And I get the change of it applying to all elections.
Right.
But then, right after that, there's a statement that says provisional ballots shall not be available for absentee voting. Why would they do that change?
We don't require that because the absentee voting already has a signature on the ballot, and how are you going to have a validation of who that person is when they're mailing it in? But there are signatures on the outside of the absentee ballot, and the reason of the elections is it was originally going to be, well, in previous step changes in '06, they had just the primary and the general, and we feel that all elections are important, and we should make sure they're all standard.
The provisional ballots, I thought those were also, and we can talk more about it, I thought those were also provided if someone, that maybe there was a dispute over what jurisdiction they were actually in, where they could cast a provisional ballot for a federal election.
Okay?
And we may just want to talk about that. I just was curious and I thought I'd ask.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just to follow up, I was actually curious about that language as well, specifically the provisional ballots not being available for absentee voting. So there's a signature on the outside of the absentee.
Have you ever voted absentee?
You know, it's been since '96, actually. I think I say that, maybe it's been more recent. Not '98, I think I voted absentee.
So-
But it's been a
So
long
in
time.
order to vote absentee, I've done it before. Recently I would go down to the election authority and just vote down there. But when I was overseas and whatnot, the outside of the envelope you sign, and you're supposed to have a notary there to authenticate who the person is that's signed the envelope and sealed the envelope. So that signature's on there, and they can cross-check that signature on the absentee ballot.
So as it stands now, if those signatures don't match and they're not verified, what happens?
I will have to get back with you on that. I do not know that 100% answer, but I believe that they would be able to verify who that was, and if they couldn't, then they may not count. But I don't know that for a fact. I will get that answer for you.
I appreciate that. One other issue that came up, and I can't recall if it was Senator Kevin or Ramona whose question led to this particular point, but the deal about the birth certificates, it was Senator Sanders' question. So some folks don't have proper birth certificates and need to get them for purposes of having a government-issued photo ID, and is that pursuant to federal law, if memory serves?
We passed a law a few years ago that required positive identification, and birth certificates was one of those documents.
In order to get a state issue, I mean, that was a state change.
Right.
Very good. And so getting a new birth certificate costs money, I assume, right?
Yes, sir.
So is there a provision in the bill as it stands now to
Pay for that.
pay for that, or is that's all the individual?
That's on the individual.
How
We
much
pay
does-
for the first, we pay for one ID, but they don't have supporting documents. That's on the individual.
How much does it cost to get a new birth certificate?
Do not know. I could guess around 10 or 11 bucks.
Okay, fair enough. I appreciate that, thank you.
It's a good question for me to find the answer.
Additional questions? Seeing none, Before we get into the testifying part of this, how many people are here wanting to testify either for or against or for information purposes only? Keep your hands up. We're trying to keep this fair and time-wise and stuff like that. Okay, thank you very much. What we're going to do, we're going to allow an hour, and we'll allow 30 minutes on each side. And that way it'll be fair to both parties. But at the end of that, it's about 2:35. So at 3:35, we will cut off testimony at that time. So make your statements brief, respect others, and we'll try and keep them at less than 5 minutes, if you would, please. Okay. Who would like to speak in favor of Senate Bill 511 or Senate Joint Resolution 31? Go ahead and come forward. Senator, do you have any witnesses?
No.
Okay. All right. No one would testify in favor of Senate Bill 511 or SJR 31. Okay, seeing none. Like to testify against it?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, again, John Scott from the Secretary of State's office. Testified against this bill last year and here to testify against it again this year. Here's what hasn't changed since last year. The first thing is Secretary Kander's position on this legislation. He's strongly against the bill, and he'll always be strongly against any piece of legislation that disenfranchises a single eligible Missouri voter. What he likes to say is that as the state's chief election official, he has the responsibility to make sure that only eligible voters vote, but that every eligible voter has the opportunity to vote. The second thing that hasn't changed is the content of the bill. If you look at the bill, it's basically the same as Senate Bill 27 of Senator Cross's last year that I testified against. And it's important to note just how restrictive the legislation is. It's not just photo ID legislation. It's quite possibly the most restrictive photo ID legislation in the country. And I think most Missourians would be surprised to see the types of identification that wouldn't be allowed under this bill. For example, a Missouri student ID, a valid out-of-state driver's license, a voter ID card issued by a local election authority. And so there's just, the bill's overbroad. It's the way that it addresses the issue of the amount of Missourians that don't have the identification required by the bill potentially disenfranchises voters. Our office earlier today pointed out that around 220,000 Missourians don't have the identification required by this legislation. And by putting those voters into a track, having them vote a provisional ballot, you put that vote at risk. And that's not something that Secretary Kander is ever going to be able to support. If you look at the 2012 election, about 30%, I think less than 30% of provisional ballots were actually counted in Missouri. So to say that you're giving someone a provisional ballot and that doesn't disenfranchise them, that doesn't quite line up with the facts. So there's a lot of groups of Missourians that would be harmed by this bill for that reason, that they don't have that ID that the legislation requires. For example, households without a vehicle. About 175,000 households in Missouri don't have a vehicle. You're less likely to drive. You're less likely to have a driver's license. People who take public transportation, about 38,000 Missourians take public transportation every day. Less likely to drive, less likely to have the ID. Missourians over the age of 75, 395,000. Less likely to drive, less likely to have the ID. Now you're going to give them the opportunity to vote a provisional ballot. Okay, you're going to have to match that elderly person's signature with a signature that could potentially be years and years old. And I'm sure there are people in the room who could attest to the fact that their signature probably isn't the same as it was years ago. College students, 450,000 approximately in the state of Missouri, less likely to be able to vote, can't use their student ID. Missourians in poverty, over 800,000 Missourians in poverty, less likely to drive, less likely to have the ID. So those two things haven't changed. Secretary's position, content of the bill. Third thing that hasn't changed is the availability of alternative proposals that are out there around the country that get at the alleged fraud, but don't disenfranchise voters. Idaho, for example, I think I touched on last year. In Idaho, you have to show a photo ID when you go to vote. If you don't have it, you sign an affidavit saying that I am who I say I am. It's under penalty of perjury. I think it's a felony. It's very serious. And you get to vote a regular ballot. That's the difference. You get to vote a regular ballot. Your ballot isn't any less likely to be counted. So here's what has changed in the past year. First item is this past fall, Secretary Kander announced that our office was launching an initiative called the Elections Integrity Unit within our office. For the first time, the Secretary of State's office has a formal process for reviewing elections, complaints, allegations of fraud. We have a hotline, people can go through the website, talk about irregularities that they see at the polls. We look into it. Every complaint gets a written response. We refer things to prosecutors. That's the first thing that has changed. Second thing, already this year, we have worked with legislators, Senator Sifton's a perfect example, to offer proposals to stiffen and raise the penalties for elections offenses. So for example, Senator Sifton's Senate Bill 728 increases the maximum sentence that folks who commit Class 1 elections offenses are subject to from 5 to 7 years, and makes voter registration fraud a Class B felony, and subjects people to up to 15 years in prison. It prohibits anyone who's pled guilty to elections fraud or been convicted of an elections offense from ever being an election judge again, a challenger again, a poll watcher again. And it also eliminates the possibility of a suspended imposition of sentence on elections offenses. You do 30 days shop time under the bill that we worked with Senator Sifton on. So,
Sean, I hate to, but we got a lot of people that drove, and you
Sure.
should visit with the senators in the Capitol, and I appreciate that.
less than a minute.
Drove quite a ways to testify, so I should have a courtesy to show respect to them.
Sure, you bet.
And
I'm almost finished.
Quick question for you.
Sure.
Does Secretary Kander really believe somebody with an out-of-state driver's license on a vote in Missouri?
I'm sorry?
Does Secretary Kander really believe that someone with an out-of-state driver's license ought to vote in Missouri? If they have a driver's license, shouldn't they have a Missouri driver's license if they're a resident?
We care about eligible voters. You can be an eligible voter in Missouri with a valid out-of-state driver's license.
Then it just seems to be a little far-fetched. Just like a student ID, that doesn't mean they're a resident of Missouri. It would be nice to know if they're a resident of Missouri so they can't vote here in Iowa or wherever they're from. I'm surprised the Secretary feels that way.
Well, if the idea is that the ID should prove who the person says they are, I don't understand why a valid student ID that looks like the person who's presenting it isn't good enough proof. I don't understand why.
I don't understand why, if you're, say you're a Missouri resident, you would have an out-of-state driver's license. But we'll say that, we'll discuss that.
I've got just a couple more points that I want to touch on, if that's okay, Senator.
I'm sorry, I just can't because of restraining time. You can come to our office and visit with us. I'm sorry. Questions, I will allow a few questions, single vote.
An out-of-state driver doesn't have a Missouri driver's license, means he's not driving in Missouri. Doesn't mean he's not necessarily voting in Missouri. That probably is where you're going to go with that. Despite this occurrence, where this guy voted for his 18-year-old son in New Mexico, that's ruining our democracy, has your office seen anything that has, in this type of, I know you have some legislation, Senator Sifton's doing when it comes to fraud, but this type of, I guess it would be voter impersonation.
Sure.
What have you seen? So again, there was nobody here to testify in favor of this bill. So I'm wondering what the issue is, and I'm not asking you, I know you and the Secretary are opposed to it, but just from your seat as the chief election, what have you seen in the area of the fraud of impersonating other voters in the state of Missouri? I know this New Mexico thing is a terrible thing, but I'm wondering about Missouri.
Sure. No documented cases of voter impersonation fraud. And, you know, that's, I think, very significant to highlight. If we want to crack down on elections offenses and fraud that has been alleged out there, let's talk about the things that people are actually talking about that are potentially happening out there that people have contacted our office about. Yeah, I don't know if anyone saw, but Judge Richard Posner, who wrote the opinion upholding the Indiana photo ID law in 2007, wrote a book last year where he said, I never imagined that this law was such a tool for voter suppression. I didn't realize it was going to disenfranchise so many people. It's his biggest regret that he's had in his decades on the bench. I think that's important to highlight.
I mean,
The Pennsylvania law was just struck down less than a month ago. The Texas law has been the laughingstock of the country. The former Speaker of the U.S. House couldn't even vote in Texas. And Missouri's, this legislation would go even further than these proposals.
Yeah, what Richard Posner, his quote is that, I'll just have it here. He noted that the Indiana law in the Crawford case is a type of law now widely regarded as a means of voter suppression rather than fraud prevention. So that's the attempt at this. Thank you.
Additional questions? Do you have a question for you, John? And there's a state representative who someone in the family was convicted of. If we had a voter ID, and theirs is not a fraud as far as saying who they were, but as far as where they were located. And if we had a voter ID card or voter ID or something like that, do you think that would have happened? In that case that happened in Missouri.
Sure. From what I know, that was voter registration fraud. This bill wouldn't do anything to address that.
An address if it was on with the card ID without making a difference.
This bill targets voter impersonation fraud. That wasn't voter impersonation fraud. The legislation that Senator Sifton has sponsored that we've worked on would have applied in that situation.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions of the witness? Seeing none. Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Next. Would you remind everybody to fill out a witness form? Thank you. Proceed.
Good afternoon.